Welcome back to A Fresh Story, the podcast where we have conversations about brave decisions to start over again. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Jenny, and we're so glad you're here today.
Hello, 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 sister. Good day to you.
And a good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir. How are you?
I'm quite well. How are you?
I'm okay. I had some yogurt, and I have my chewy granola bar here sitting at my desk because we love chewy granola bars. I have like a weird obsession with them.
Yeah, I feel like everything I know about intuitive eating could be blown up by a chewy granola bar. Like I don't I don't eat to the point of being uncomfortable anymore. Unless I was like left alone with a box of chewy chocolate chip granola bars. I have a box of like
60 of them, and it's not safe for me.
No,
but
it wouldn't be safe for me.
When Jenny and I were teachers back in the day, they used to have them in the teachers' lounge, and actually they had them for snack at school too. Probably
when I was a kid, they would have bring out a big tray of food or whatever, a big cart, and I would eat 12 at snack time.
Yeah, Quaker.
I would eat 12.
Yeah. Well,
it's a lot. But it doesn't fill you up. I don't understand.
I don't know. It's perfect. It's a perfect snack. I was lying in bed the other night, and I just wanted that combination of the honey, oats, chocolate chips, sticky. Yeah. Oh my God, perfect. Anyway, speaking of food and some of our food issues,
you can sponsor us. We did go to a Quaker high school. We're kind of the perfect sponsorees. If you
Quaker
want
Oats, call us. We talked to Cole Kazdin. Cole is a journalist. She is an amazing, vocal woman about, bodies and
the way eating disorder recovery and talking all about, do we ever recover? How do we recover? What is the industry like? How does the industry make money? All these really important questions.
And I'm going to geek out for a second, as somebody that loves reading and I've been a big reader my whole life, to be able to read a book that I got from the library and ask the author to come on our podcast is mind blowing to me. And talk about meet your idols. I mean, she was so awesome. We became good friends with her, and she's going to come back because we just didn't have enough time to talk about everything.
I feel like when we were like, 8 and 10, Anna Martin, the writer of the Babysitters Club books, came to our local bookstore, Book Review, which is since closed, but it's kind of reopened as the next chapter. And we met Anne M. Martin. And I feel like that started something for you. That was like the drug.
I don't remember that.
You don't remember?
For me, it was Gordon Corman.
You and Gordon Corman.
I love the Gordon Corman books, and Gordon Corman's mother-in-law.
Yeah, his wife was married to.
Went to our grandfather's medical practice, so he got me signed books.
That's not right. No, that's not what it was. His wife's mom was one of Pop-Up's friends.
That's what I'm saying. No, his wife's mom.
It was closer than just a patient.
I don't know, but anyway,
it was Trudy Iserson.
No, I don't know. But also I got the Backstreet Boys pictures that I still have because one of Nick Carter's aunt or something. What was it?
What is wrong with you? What do you think Nick Carter's aunt is doing on the
I don't know.
Joey Fatone.
Joey Fatone.
Oh my God. Nick Carter.
I don't know. It's been a long 38 years, okay?
It has. I don't know. We need to go meditate.
I don't even do drugs.
Joey? If you need to look at the Backstreet Boys, find the Backstreet Boys, because where's these guys? It's family on Long Island.
I don't know. Okay. Anyway, our paternal grandfather had a medical practice in East Meadow for many, many, many years.
I don't know if you need to explain this part.
But I'm going to explain it anyway, because there was another part of the story that had nothing to do with anything, but I'm going to throw it in here anyway. And Jerry Garcia came to play at Jones Beach.
I don't know the story.
He couldn't breathe. He was having trouble, and he went to Pop-Up.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, and he wouldn't give him. There was some medication he wanted that, he wouldn't give him. It was probably not legal or something.
Because Jerry Garcia didn't have cash.
I don't know, but that. By the way, this could be made up, but that's what I heard. That's what I wouldn't have made that up.
Joey Fatone's probably aunt, maybe grandma,
maybe
was a patient of our grandfather's, and you did get something signed.
I got some photos, some early photos that I still have of the Backstreet Boys. Yeah, I will sell those for money someday.
Yeah, okay.
We'll fund the company that way.
Anyway, with that one.
We love Cole. You will love this episode. If you are somebody that survived the millennial years, those 2000s, and the jeans and the low cut jeans.
Jessica Simpson is a whale years is what we'll call them.
You will definitely love and What's Eating Us is really it's the first book I ever felt seen in with my disordered eating disorder. So please enjoy this episode with Cole. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to A Fresh Story so that we can keep telling fresh start stories. I'm thinking about Joey Fatone now. Cole Kazdin is a writer, performer, and 4-time Emmy Award-winning television journalist. She has written for Vice, Time, The New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Los Angeles Magazine, The Daily Beast, and many others. I'm out of breath, actually. And she has produced for Good Morning America, Nightline, and World News Tonight. She has told stories live on the Moth's main stage across the country and the Moth Radio Hour on NPR. Her first book, What's Eating Us? Women, Food, and the Epidemic of Body Anxiety, blends personal narrative and investigative reporting to reveal disordered eating as an epidemic crisis killing millions of women. Now, I am going to talk about where I came across this book. I literally was in my library. It was in the new book section. And as somebody that has had disordered eating and eating disorders my entire life, since I was 4 years old, I immediately picked it up. As soon as I opened it, literally from the first line, I was like, I texted Jenny and I'm like, we have to have her on the podcast. Yep. It is the first book, and I've read about diet culture and eating disorders forever. It's like a hobby of mine. The first book I felt seen and understood that like disordered eating is an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. And the work you did blending your personal story with the investigative journalism and blowing up the eating disorder, everything, and the diet culture and the connections between everything is so brilliant. I was so moved by this book. I mean, I talked about it so much on Instagram, I stopped tagging you because you'd be like, who is the stalker who keeps tagging me? Tag me. I love it. I'm so grateful you're here today because this is a conversation I have been waiting 38 years to have. And just thank you for the work you do.
Thank you for that intro. And I always feel a connection when someone talks about how much they can relate to the book and to my story. But I also have compassion and empathy and sympathy for that. I kind of always want to lead with, I'm so sorry that you can relate so deeply to my experience. Yeah, I find myself saying that to everybody, because it is so common.
It's so common, and it's become so common that it's like scary, right? And like that's the conversation that we're having. So I hope this is the start of a long journey for you in this world, because you are changing the way we speak about this. And I just think it's necessary in order to keep going, because it's not about the food, right? And that's what I keep saying. It's never about the food. And that's the conversation we need to be having.
Well, thank you. I'm moved by both of your passions for this. And so thank you. I'm getting emotional already. I'm glad Good.
We love that. That's our goal, is to make people
cry. There will be cry. Like I started crying.
I have my therapist on speed dial here for this episode.
How are you doing today, Cole, in this moment?
I am doing well. I made that cup of tea. I thought this was that kind of conversation in a good way. I slept last night. I ate a little bit. I'm getting my body ready for a hunkered down, wonderful, deep, light also. It can be light. Let's find something funny in it. Conversation.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
I very much understand. I have my tea here, too, with milk. Oat milk. And I was like starving before this, and I'm in the UK, so it's 6:00 here, and I was like, we're having dinner right after this. I was like, but I really want a snack, and I was like, I should have a snack. My body deserves a snack. So I had some peanuts right before we did this, because
great,
we don't have to deny ourselves things.
No, that's the whole conversation.
Exactly. Well, this is perfect. Why don't you take us back to the beginning of your Fresh Start story?
Well, in knowing that I was going to be speaking to you both, I was thinking about what's the beginning. And there is no beginning because we're born into this very messed up culture about food and our bodies. So I think that the Fresh Start part for me begins actually in the middle, because I had eating disorders and disordered eating on and off to some degree, much of my life. And the start for me begins after treatment, when I thought I was better or hoped I would be better. I mean, I was so optimistic. Like, I did everything right, found the best treatment, the most researched treatment, found a great therapist. It was really hard and didn't feel good a lot of the time, but that's how it's supposed to be. And when I completed treatment, they don't grade you, but if they did, I would have performed A+. Yeah. I didn't feel fully better. The thoughts hadn't really calmed down. I still felt tortured by them. The doubt of, is this my eating disorder talking? Is this me talking? What am I supposed to do? How can I be not a person with an eating disorder? And I relapsed constantly. Yeah. And then you feel like you failed at your eating disorder treatment, which is the thing you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I really thought there was something wrong with me, that this treatment didn't stick. Cognitive behavioral therapy, that's the one. That's the thing. Let's do that one. Yeah. It didn't stick. It didn't change all of my behaviors. It didn't change the thoughts. And I really thought there was something wrong with me. And then at a certain point, I decided to approach this, instead of as a patient, as a journalist, because that's what I do. And it's a great skill to have if you're trying to solve a mystery. So I thought, I wonder if anyone else feels this way at the end of their treatment. And I found way too many women who did. Yeah. And then I really set out to look at this the way I would a story. If I were working on a story about eating disorders and why the treatment didn't seem to be working, I would talk to the top experts in the world. I would get access to people who would probably never talk to me as a patient, but absolutely would as a journalist, and talk to other women, figure out the history of this, how this is sustained by our culture, how we got here, why we have these disorders, and is there any hope, which quite honestly, I didn't expect. And that was okay. It wasn't like, oh, I'm so sad there's no hope, though. I mean, that is very sad, but I had accepted the way things were and was just like, you're a person who has this and you're going to relapse a couple times a year and you're just going to do your best. And is there any way you could maybe take the edge off? And if not, maybe you could discover some things that help someone else. Right. But I discovered so much hope. I mean, the eating disorder, I was thinking about this yesterday in advance of our conversation. There's this mythical, like almost Bigfoot sighting aspect of like, oh, my friend's aunt recovered. She's doing great. Right. She's doing great. Right. And you don't know that person personally, but you hear the stories. And so after a while, you just don't believe them. You're like, oh, that's not Bigfoot. That's Photoshop, you know? Yeah. So, but to my surprise, I discovered people who really not just are saying it, who really are living a different way. Yeah. And I discovered people who aren't 100% quote cured, but getting there, finding ways to offset ways they're harming their body. I started looking at this in a less rigid way. And I have to say, the process of researching and writing the book really did offer me a lot of healing. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I what are you going to say, Jenny? Something?
No, it just sounds like that first step started with giving yourself a lot of grace and like sort of a softness of like, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe it'll never be, but like, at least I should get curious and see what there's out there. And like, that sounds like the first step.
And I was frankly outraged. Yeah. Right. I mean, I think you're right. There is softness there. I didn't see it at the time. I was outraged when you start to look at the statistics. Every 52 minutes, someone's dying of an eating disorder, direct result of their eating disorder. why isn't everyone talking about this all the time?
Mm-hmm.
I love all the books about opioids. I love all the books, right? It's an epidemic. It's a crisis. It has to be addressed. Eating disorders are right up there.
Yeah.
Eating disorders, similar mortality rates, but we're not talking about them.
Mm-mm. No. And why do you think we're not talking about them?
I think it's a great question, why we're not talking about eating disorders. And there's more than one answer. I think one reason we're not talking about them is they're embarrassing for those of us who have them. And so there's just so much shame.
Yeah.
So if you have an eating disorder, you're not going to get loud about it. You're suffering, and you really do think there's something wrong with you, and you're trapped.
Yeah.
And for those of us there's a lot of new research that's for many people who have eating disorders, they're brain-based.
Yeah.
So this is not for everyone, but for many people. So this is not something you're choosing, this sullen 13-year-old girl in after school special who wishes that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not, no. So I think that we don't talk about it because we don't understand them, but there's also a lot of shame.
Yeah.
There's a lot of shame.
I have to imagine too, like diets are just institutionalized eating disorders, right? So there's a very slim type of body type. There's a very narrow body type that's allowed to sort of say they have an eating disorder. And a lot of women who are, not in that body type, it's like, well, it's clearly not working, right? Like that's the kind of pervasive thing. So the shame is added on top of it of like, now I'm saying that I restrict or I binge or I, purge or I just never stop thinking about food. Mm-hmm. And then I'm also going to have people looking at me going like, well, maybe you should try harder or something. It's like added on shame on top of that.
I mean, the medical community reinforces this with the categorization called atypical anorexia, which is anorexia that's not meeting a certain BMI criteria. So I'm not trying to be glib about this as someone who suffered from this, not skinny enough for anorexia.
Yeah.
So if you are a human being who genetically, biologically, in all the ways, your body may never get to that, quote, goal weight for anorexia. I mean, it's ridiculous that I have to say it in that way. Mm-hmm. But you may look like you are in a larger body and you may be anorexic because you are starving yourself to stay in that place.
Yeah.
We're not used to thinking about eating disorders in that way.
No. And I think there's so much here. I
this
remember,
is our life's work. I mean, in one way or another, we could talk about this. We've been thinking about this. Yeah.
It's really all we talk about, and I think our grandmother who struggled with her own eating disorders, right? Disordered eating, because it's generational for a lot of families. Mm-hmm. She once said something to me about the fact that when she was, I guess, in her 30s or whatever, back in the 70s, 60s, all the women were on diet pills, right? And these diet, whatever. And she made some comment like, well, yeah, it's easier to control us, right? When our brains aren't fully working. And I have been thinking about that since she said that. I think I was about 16. And your book really hammered that home for me, that when we spend all of our time thinking about our body and thinking about what we put in our body, food-wise, right? We're not thinking about the fact that our rights are being taken away from us. We're not thinking about the fact that we are overworked and underpaid, right? Mm-hmm. All of these things. And so it is kind of a form of like brainwashing.
Well,
right.
I mean, Stepford Wives wasn't written about nothing, right?
Yeah. And if we really want to look at it from a conspiracy standpoint,
we are always about that.
There's a lot of research that shows that food restriction affects our cognitive abilities.
100%.
So there are studies, right, where dieters are given a task to complete math problem or whatever, and they are slower to do it than people that are not restricting food. So we see this in labs in really controlled ways that you think of that old joke, and I mentioned this in the book, but that would you would you sacrifice 10 IQ points to be 10 pounds thinner? And that's kind of what happens.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what they do in a cult, right? When you go and you join an intentional community like that, they often restrict your food. And the same diet that they're feeding people so that they're pliable and compliant is what we're told as teenage girls, just cut out carbs, just do this. Like it's trying to make us have weaker minds so that we can be more compliant and pliable, and also constantly striving for that worthiness, right? Of like, I'm thin enough, so I'm worthy. So I'm not going to notice that you're not treating me right in this relationship, speaking from personal experience.
And it's kind of amazing all we're able to do while we're restricting our food, right? It speaks to our acumen and our resilience, right? It's not a good thing, but and I notice it, you can't unsee it once you start noticing it. I was just at, my son is 3 now, and we just got invited to about 48 birthday parties now that he just started school. And, at one of the first party we went to on Saturday, there was the grandmother of the birthday girl was there, and she had her arms crossed and she was just looking around. I introduced myself and she said, I've been waiting all week for a piece of that cake. And she was just waiting. The party hadn't even started yet. And she'd been waiting for that cake. And, you don't want to say anything because I have great compassion. It's so tough. And, and she looked to be about, I don't know, maybe in her 60s, 70s. And you just want her to just dig into the cake. But you also have I have a lot of empathy for where she is at. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not her fault. It's not none of that. Right.
It's amazing. And I'm sure you see a little bit of this because I'm going to guess you raised your son in probably a different way that you were raised, generally speaking. But, I know raising my kids, my sons are 10 and 7, and I have never restricted them. I have never, had it's anything that was done. It was in my childhood. I have flipped it the opposite direction. And so they don't even understand. It's like they're from a different planet of food and mindset and eating, right? They don't binge on, chocolate because they are allowed to have it whenever they want. Right. And it's wild because it's like, oh my God, that could have been me. Right. But it wasn't. And I think that that's true for so many women of this, like, Gen X, Gen Z, millennial-ish generations. Right. So do you, and I want to, we'll go back, but like, just generally speaking, as like a mom, I know your son is young, but like, do you just see a difference in like the way that you approach food with him, and generally speaking?
I do, and I want to, but I will say that initially my thoughts were, gee, if I have a son, I never have to think about this. It's only if I have a daughter, which is absolutely incorrect, right? You want everyone to have a healthy relationship with food, right? And I started noticing, I would read all the books and the blogs, and well, not all the books, maybe one, and took like 2 modules of a 10 module online course that I ended up not having time to finish.
All the books and all the modules,
some Instagram posts,
And there was one time early on when he was started eating solid food, where I was not eating with him and I was feeding him, and he said, "Mama, eat." Like he wanted me to eat with him, and I thought, oh shit. I'm not modeling this. I'm doing it, but I'm not modeling it. So that was pretty early on. And I just noticed that no matter how important it is for me to model how I talk about food, look at food, make food fun, cook together, get messy together. That's a learning process for me, like I really need to, and so I am learning that, but it also comes down to, with him, I just want him to eat. He doesn't not like food, but you know how toddlers are. Someday they eat everything. Sometimes they want to eat nothing. So he'll eat like some grapes and raspberries for breakfast and not touch the rest of it. And then we go to the birthday party. He eats 5 pieces of pizza. And I'm so excited that he ate the pizza because I want food in his tummy, right? Stomach, grown-ups. At the table.
I say tummy. So. I was told not to put it in something the other day. Olivia said, say stomach, not tummy.
That's the actual word. But I think what I've just had such an appreciation for since having a child is the importance of just eating.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about that enough. Like you just need to eat.
Yeah.
And you get to the other stuff later. Like you have these visions, if you look at enough Instagram, of like, oh, my child's going to shove entire stalks of broccoli and chomp on them. And this is not happening, right? Like I know if there's a piece of bread on the table or a banana, that's going to get eaten, and the other stuff I hope for. And sometimes he surprises me and sometimes he's not hungry, but I just try to make everything available. And I try to have fun myself around him with food.
You know, just to that point, I don't have children, but I was very involved with Olivia's too, or I am very involved. And we don't talk about, like, so much of it is just who the person is, what your genetics are. Like Olivia's older son has always just been a really good, well-rounded eater. Like he would just try things. If you're like, hey, do you want to try mushrooms? He's like, I don't know if I like it, but I'll try it, from a very young age. Whereas her younger son is just a little bit more like a traditional, like the kids we see on TV. And it's so funny because you can't account for that. And so much of it, you know, Olivia and I talk about this a lot. This is related. Of like, you see these Instagram influencers that are like, all you have to do is follow my diet. And you're like, you were born with these genes. Like so much of it is just what the body we're born into, and the genes we're born with, and our tongues, the way that they are too. Like you can't account for that. And so, like you said, just making the food available, like eating, the modeling is so important too.
But I struggle with that whole you provide, they decide idea. I am always mindful of it, but I'm always, you know, do you want to finish your pancakes? Did you have, I have to pull myself back from that so that he learns to trust. And I also, you know, err on the other side. You know, he said something the other day about he doesn't want to eat too much to get sick. And I'm like, where did you hear that?
Yeah. So Cole, take us back. So you grew up where?
We moved around a lot. I guess many formative years in Pittsburgh, but we moved around a lot. Yeah.
And then what is your experience like with disordered eating and eating disorders? Like, where did that come from? Where did that start?
Well, I think, you know, I was a dancer, which doesn't give you an eating disorder, but it puts a little wind at your back if you have that tendency. And I genuinely don't know the exact moment of when something started, because you hear about diets, you're in the world, you know, you see covers of magazines about health, you know, even back in the 70s and 80s, health and weight loss were so conflated. We're just really seeing that more and more. But I do remember, it's so funny because one of the researchers I interviewed for the book was talking about, he's one of the brain researchers, one of the top researchers in the world. And he also said often someone can experience a traumatic event or just trauma in their lives, and they may have no predisposition, but they develop an eating disorder immediately after, say, loss of a parent or divorce. And so I started noticing these behaviors when my parents separated, when I was a teenager. But being an adolescent is also the prime time to develop an eating disorder because your body's changing. So it's this, it's not even a chicken egg thing. It's like chicken, egg, farm, ducklings, everything. They're so complex that you may have an eating disorder onset because you're primed for it because of your genetics and biology. It's how your brain is misfiring. You could suffer a traumatic event or multiple traumatic events, everyday racism, which I did not experience, but many women of color experience, if not all. That is considered a big stressor that can contribute to the onset of an eating disorder. I don't want to say causation because that's very difficult to prove, but in terms of associations and correlations.
Yeah, you get into that in your book. So if anybody wants to like dig in more, they should read the book because you talk a lot about that.
But for me, it was really just like, it just got worse and worse and worse. Yeah. And when I stopped dancing, which was a very demanding schedule and very little eating, I went back to graduate school for journalism, and that was in my late 20s. That's when I knew that something like really needed to be done, and the behaviors intensified. And I really just would not eat. I would purge what I did eat, and it, quote unquote, worked.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting because you talk a lot about this in the book, but this idea that we're so accustomed to it's anorexia or bulimia, right? That's it. There's two. And then if you don't fit into one of those categories, you're just a normal woman and you're totally good to go. Right. But I have had intrusive thoughts about eating. I've had restriction. I've never purged, but I've binged many, 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 many times. And I have started to talk about this more openly that, binge eating in particular, right? Binge eating disorder is not just sitting there eating bags of chips, right? That's not what it actually looks like. Maybe it does for some people, but for me, what it means is I already brushed my teeth. I should just go to sleep, but instead I choose to go eat more food because I'm not hungry, right? But it's filling some other need in me, right? And so then I don't sleep well because I have food in my stomach, and then I have that shame and the guilt, right? So maybe I'm eating leftover Chinese food, right? Which to an ordinary person, if I said, hey, cool, I was eating leftover Chinese food last night, you'd be like, cool, great, whatever. But for me, right, I know that it's a binge. And so I think that there's so much nuance in the eating disorder world, and that's a very hard thing to understand. So how did you tackle that from a journalistic point of view?
It's so tricky because you set out to look for an answer and there isn't one. Mm-hmm. Right? And then you think, wait a minute, who's in charge here? And you talk to the researchers and you say, I'm asking a tough question. Why isn't there an answer? And they're like, we are trying. We're with you, sister. Yeah. We're working on it. We don't have the funding, right? Yeah. This whole, once you pull that thread, sweater's gone. But in terms of defining eating disorders, there are in the, the official, in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, that's what it's called. There is, anorexia, bulimia, which is actually binging and then purging. I would eat an apple and purge. That's not officially bulimia, but that is not a good thing to be doing. It's harmful to the body, right? Anorexia. And then you have this whole other category that's called OSFED, which is other specified feeding and eating disorders. And it's this catch-all. And their heart's in the right place, the American Psychiatric Association, because you need to create a catch-all when you have so many disorders. Some of them aren't clearly defined, and you want to get maybe insurance to cover them, right? So OSFED, this person has OSFED, which is maybe it's one of these atypical anorexia, they're kind of in the midst of defining, or maybe it's just something else. But most people in community clinics for eating disorders are in that category, that sort of hazy eating disorder category. Your chance of dying from an eating disorder is the same if you're in that hazy category as if you have one of the so-called official, more clearly defined eating disorders. So many people, most people don't have this sort of perfect textbook definition of an eating disorder, which makes it difficult to study, which makes it difficult to treat. But it's most people. And I mean, I have to just comment on what you were saying. You may only have been partially in control of what you call a binge, right? It's totally. Your brain is maybe not triggering fullness cues. Your brain, 100%. Right?
Yep. Yeah, no, 100% cool. I mean, there's subconscious things that play there. I definitely think there's genetics. Our family has genetic issues. Yeah. There's dopamine. I mean, we come from a long line of not just eating disorders, but, a lot of binge eating grandparents and, Overeaters Anonymous and being raised in such a pervasive, food first, family, right? Being Ashkenazi Jewish on both sides and, all the things, right? And so I have tried so many things, right? And I've done a lot of successful things in terms of I now know what it feels like, right? When I go into these places and how I can ground myself back, very similar to a lot of the work you've done, right? And that you can, as you said, I relapse a few times a year as well. I've started to talk more about that, right? What does that look like to be a CEO and a single mom who relapses from an eating disorder? Because it's not fun, right? And you have to then fucking deal with your shit. And that's hard. So I would love to talk a little bit about the part of the book that really blew me away was the rehab centers and the eating disorder clinics. because I never really knew anybody that went to one. I did not attend one. They are a completely different thing than I ever thought of. So what was that like? And if you could give like a little background, just a snippet of kind of what you have in the book there, so people can read more about it in the book. But that was really eye-opening.
So are you talking about, so I was never in residential treatment, but I did do a lot of research about that kind of treatment. Yeah. So, I mean, what it all comes down to is that in this country, in the United States, there's no standard of care for eating disorders.
Yeah.
Which basically means there's no prescription. If you came to a doctor and you had diabetes, they would give you medication. There's a certain thing you have to do. If they told you to ride a horse to help your diabetes, you could sue them. I would think, right?
Right.
In eating disorders, there's no standard of care. So there are certain therapies that have a lot of research that are probably your best bet and don't help everyone get better. Fingers crossed. Don't help everyone get better, but help a lot of people get better. There's a family-based treatment that works really, really well with children and families. But there's no standard of care. And it's a for-profit industry. So you're taking a big gamble when you enter a treatment facility. And it's heartbreaking because when a family has a loved one with an eating disorder, or an adult who's on their own is seeking help for an eating disorder, it takes so much to get to the point where you're willing to get help or where you're willing to entertain that idea. It takes, I mean, someone should throw you a parade for getting to that point. It's huge that you may take your next step into an environment that could make you worse. Is appalling.
I keep thinking about the part in the book that you talk about when one of the places you were researching said they have horseback riding, right? And the researcher you were talking to, right, said that's like the last thing you need when your bones are brittle is to be on a horse, right? And it's like that, I think, is the best way to explain. And like you said, there are places that can maybe help. I'm not surprised that the family, like what do they call it, like the family therapy or the
family-based treatment.
I'm not surprised that is, because this again is not about the food, right? There's always something there, right? It's control. It's, it's usually like there's other people involved, but it's the brain, it's the mental stuff, and that's what I couldn't stop thinking about that throughout the whole book. Is like nobody, I mean, you talk about this, but you were the first person to say it's not about the food. This is about the brain. It's about the person. It's about the things they've been through, right? Like, and I studied hypnotherapy. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist, and as I read that book as I was studying to be a hypnotherapist, and so these things were like all in my head, right, with subconscious reprogramming and the whole thing, and I'm thinking, there are so many deeper issues, right? Like, it's not about the things we're putting in our mouth. It's about what we've been through. Like, I think one of the women you talk about in the book I think her father was a policeman or a cop or something. And I was thinking, well, they probably had a really strict household, right? There's so many other things at play with eating disorders, and we just sweep that under the rug so easily.
Yeah. Yes.
I think that we're just starting to understand like addictions like alcoholism and drug abuse as coping mechanisms. And the way I understand eating disorders it's another coping mechanism, right? It's a way of understanding or controlling the world for whatever reason. I had a friend who developed an eating disorder after she was attacked on the street because she was like, I don't want to look like a woman. I'm going to do as much as I can so I'm never attacked again to not look like a woman. I'm going to starve myself so I don't look like a woman, And it's like things like that where that was never about the food, right? That was so unrelated to the food. And so if we think of eating disorders or disordered eating or whatever you want to call it as a way of controlling the uncontrollable and a coping mechanism, it starts to make sense. And then you start looking at things like Ozempic or Mounjaro or, Noom and things like this, like all these systems that are coming into play to deal with the top layer, which is the food and the weight, which is kind of the least interesting part of the whole thing, right? It's an iceberg underneath the surface that needs to be dealt with. Otherwise, you're just chipping away at this tiny little top.
And when we get into the brain research, which doesn't apply to everyone with an eating disorder, but I'm pretty sure from the researchers I spoke with and talked to very specifically about my own experience, I'm pretty sure that applies to me. When you get into the brain research, it's not about a conscious control necessarily at all, right? You have a brain that's misfiring. I mean, I get into this a lot more deeply in my book, but there was a study with women who had a history of anorexia and women who didn't, and could they go a whole day without eating? That was the study. And for the women who never had anorexia, they had the normal human response to not eating. The brain kind of freaks out and you start getting obsessed with food. You're very hungry. You start looking for food. All you can think about for food, we got to find some food. For the women who had a history of anorexia, that didn't happen. They went a day with eating and they were fine. Their brains just weren't telling them to go eat.
Do you think that there's got to be, I'm thinking, because that's me, and I also have ADHD, I'm neurodivergent, which I think is a huge part of this too that we're not talking about, is neurodivergent women, especially who are underdiagnosed like crazy. They eat differently. They have different sensitivities. They need to eat at different times. So that could often, being forced to a 3 meal a day, standard American diet doesn't work for a lot of those women, right? And so I could totally go hours and hours. I don't think, there are times that I don't think about food. I can't help but think there has to be some sort of generational genetic component, right? Where it's like maybe your ancestors didn't have food for a while, right? And so they needed to know how to survive. Did you find any research that there was some sort of genetic generational relationship?
I didn't get into the generational relationships, but food scarcity is very, very deeply associated with eating disorders. If you do not have food access, that can lead directly to binge eating, right? It's like the same similar effect as being on an extreme diet. You don't have access to food. So when you get access, you better get it. And that's, again, a survival mechanism.
Yeah. We saw that in our grandmother, who was a child during the Depression and had major, major food scarcity. And then she ended up at Overeaters Anonymous because then she, had all sides of that. I thought a lot about this during the reading of your book too, which is that, I was born in 85, so I'm like kind of at the older end of the millennials, but our generation, the millennials, were raised by women who, a lot of them had eating disorders, right? But didn't tell their daughters that they had eating disorders and just expected their daughters to be thin. And
they didn't understand that they had eating disorders.
Right. I guess a lot of them, that was just how they were. Right. So, but a lot of them were not eating, or they were using diet pills, or they were purging or whatever. And so I think there was a lot of, expectations, right, put on millennial women to look a certain way, as we know, it's all over the press. There's a huge relationship between the mother-daughter thing with eating disorders. Did you find that at all in your research?
A lot of people I spoke with had families that were weird around food, is how they would describe it. And sometimes, it's very common for the mother to be that person, especially when the language is, this is what I do to stay in shape. This is what I do to maintain my weight. This is how I stay trim, or whatever, some antiquated way of talking about body that is not disordered eating. And it definitely carries through to all the diet culture-y things we hear today. I looked on the back of a box of chickpea pasta, which I just enjoy. Can I just enjoy that too? I have all kinds of pasta in my house. And on the back it said 25% less carbs than regular, or something like that. And I thought, why is that? Right? It wasn't totally gluten-free, so it wasn't about that, but it was about less carbs. So it's so normalized the way we talk about this that we really have to overcorrect with our kids.
Yeah.
100%. What was the most astonishing thing that you found researching for your book?
God, there was just so much. I mean, I think two things come to mind immediately. One is just statistically, the age range of people with eating disorders, that eating disorders can begin as young as 8 years old. I wonder if it's or even earlier, but in terms of statistics that are written down, 8 years old and up to 80 years old. Now, both of those I believe, and both of those I would even pad on either end, just from anecdotal experience and from my research, right? So when we look at that, we really see the scope of this. And so that statistic wasn't necessarily, no, it was astonishing, because even though it was like, oh yeah, that sounds about right, it still is astonishing when you see that in print. Yeah. But the other part that was astonishing was the hope part, in concrete ways, that there are new therapies being developed, that there's new research being developed. I mean, the Department of Defense is doing amazing research funding because of how eating disorders affect the military. Yeah. That's who you want on this. That's who you want. You want the Department of Defense throwing money at eating disorders, right? That's great. Yeah. So, so those sorts of things astonished me. The hope part of who's, it's too bad it's not happening a different way. Right. But what is happening is exciting.
Yeah. It's so interesting about the military, though, because often we see that issues aren't really attended to until they affect men in the same way that they affect women. And I imagine that there's a huge eating disorder issue in the Army, or I'm sorry, in the military, relating to men as well as women. I imagine you see a really condensed population of that there.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking really at women and their daughters. And so that's where they were seeing a lot of eating disorder development, but I'm sure men too. I mean, that's the other thing. My book focuses on women. That's my story, my lived experience, and the lane I chose to stay in. Women statistically get eating disorders at twice the rate of men. But I mean, someone I hope writes the male eating disorder book and the non-binary eating disorder book.
What is, I mean, just if you know, what is like the statistics just on like women and men, and like who gets like the rate of eating disorders?
The accepted gender split in the official statistic, which is approximately 30 million Americans will have an eating disorder in their lifetime. That's the statistic for this country. As we've seen eating disorders skyrocket during the pandemic, I imagine those numbers are in desperate need of revision, and it's going to be a lot higher. But that split along gender lines, which again leaves out non-binary folks, is about 10 million men, 20 million women.
Okay, which is a lot. And I do think that, like, we don't talk, like you referenced earlier, when you knew you were having a boy, you were like, well, dodge that bullet, but it's not. And when you realize all the ways that men show up with eating disorders differently than women, I do think that it's interesting that the military would study it, because that's often how we get access to research, is through men, unfortunately. And hopefully it helps, right? Like, hopefully it helps, all of these, the orthorexia and like all of that, I think we see a lot more in men. And that's very interesting.
And I imagine eating disorders often show up for men differently, but often they don't. I mean, I've received emails from men who've read my book that talk about history of purging. There's the exercise obsession and the building muscle angle, of course, but starving, purging, a lot of these behaviors that we associate with women with an eating disorder.
And then we institutionalize it. So it's like, just meal prep, bro, and have 5 small meals of chicken and, white rice a day. And it's like, there's a reason that the military doesn't give everybody food in a pill. It's because your food's supposed to be interesting. Like, your body needs that sort of interest to eat it. And this isn't healthy, my friend.
No. And I think it was I think you talked about this in your book, that, all of these like diets, right? I was a pro Whole30 person. I was in the cult for many years, paleo all the way. And it's not until I look back on it and see how restrictive it is and all of these things. And so I think the reason I love your book so much is because it really does start asking those questions, right? You were curious, you set out to answer these questions, and it made me think about this stuff in my own life. And that's the goal of the book.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that.
You know, it is. And the last piece of that before we finish is like the anxiety piece, right? Because it's all related to anxiety and those intrusive thoughts about food. What have you felt, and I know you talk about this in the book, has been helpful for your anxiety as you kind of have learned more about yourself?
In my personal experience, and I will say to my surprise, eating regularly has been the number one regulator for my anxiety.
Me too.
Now, I'm not saying I'm a calm, laid back person. I am not. I do my best with the meditating. I mean, does anyone meditate regularly? That's another
Bigfoot. That's the next
Someone
book,
meditates regularly.
That's your next book.
The next book. It'll be very short. But eating regularly.
Yeah.
And making sure that every few hours I eat something. I have peanuts in the cupboard for the same reason.
Yeah.
Not hungry, but it's been a few hours. I need to eat something.
Yeah.
And practicing that helps my anxiety. I was, when the book first came out, I was doing, readings and bookstore signings, and I was on my way to one with my husband locally here in Los Angeles. And in the car, I thought to myself, I should not have worn these shoes. I should have worn the other shoes. And I said to my husband, do you think I should have worn these shoes? He said, I don't know, those shoes are fine. I said, should we turn around? I want to go back up to the apartment and get those shoes. And I started having a little bit of a moment. And fortunately, I've done so much research and wrote a whole book about this. I stopped myself and I asked, when did you last eat? That's the first question I asked myself now. And I did the math, and it had been about 5 hours because I was busy. I was busy with my child. I was in the shower. I was getting ready. Mm-hmm. And then I have a little bar in my purse at all times. I ate the bar and I stopped caring about the shoes.
Yeah. There's this idea that there are thoughts and don't happen in our bodies, and that thought doesn't happen in your body, and that food is not somehow related to every other system. And so we have this moralistic view of like, well, you shouldn't have eaten, or now whatever. And it all happens in here. They're all organs. We need our blood sugar to stay regulated, and that affects our anxiety and like all of these things. We need fats and we need sugars and we need protein, all of it. And I always get really stuck in this idea that we think that our thoughts happen like above our heads, that our brain's somehow not part of the system.
We are whole bodies.
Yeah.
We are whole bodies, top to bottom, through and through.
Yep.
I found the same thing. I was just saying this to Jenny the other day. The one thing that has helped my binge eating more than anything is making sure that I eat 3 meals a day. And I'm not even like really a 3 meal a day person, but it's like a mental thing. Like, no, you ate. Like, you were good. You had food. Like, you nourished yourself. You don't need to go back and eat more. If I don't eat actual 3 meals a day, I trick myself right into thinking like, oh, well, you didn't really eat it, so you need to go back and eat it. It's all connected. So if somebody's going through a fresh start, what would be some wise words that you could give to them, Cole?
I think with pertaining to what we're talking about, and again, this might sound counterintuitive, but you can't rush when you're ready to get better. Mm-hmm. I think it's so personal, and it has to be so individually led. It has to come from you, that you can't rush getting better. Yeah. And also that, even if you feel alone, and these disorders feel so isolating, and then they thrive in isolation, but you're not alone. And that was something that that's the main thing from my book, to show someone else that they are not alone, even if they don't know me, even if they don't know all of the women I interviewed in the book, that so many of us are dealing with this, have dealt with this. You are absolutely not alone. And when you're ready, there is help.
Yeah, I love that. And then I am going to tell my story before we ask your final question, which was my very first therapy session, which I started with my therapist years ago because of my binge eating. She said to me, what is your ideal breakfast? And I said to her, oh, egg whites and some fruit. And she was like, bullshit. Like, what is it? And I was like, pancakes. I want the fucking pancakes. Yeah. And so and that moment like changed everything for me. So that being said, what was the last thing that you really loved eating recently?
Well, the other night I made spaghetti with garlic and olive oil and herbs.
It's perfect.
Why did I forget that existed? It's such a great meal. And I think also when you're feeding a child, I'm so used to let's put chickpeas in here. There were no chickpeas in it. It was just spaghetti with garlic and olive oil and chopped up herbs. And it was so simple and so delicious and so perfect. We might need to go into a part 2 of this episode to talk about it for another half hour.
It's like a very Nora Ephron meal. Yeah, that's like a very
Olivia and I could talk about pasta. We should have a separate podcast where we just talk about pasta.
Yeah, I would listen to that.
That's
so
perfect.
Yeah. So that is the answer to that one.
It's a great.
Cool. What's coming up next for you? What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm just still very excited about this book and getting it out into the world and talking to people. And then you're always, thinking about what the next thing is. And I think a lot about mental health and all the things that I think women is still very focused on women's issues, think about and wrestle with. But for right now, I'm doing my very best to slow down.
Well, you have a 3-year-old, so I don't know how much you're going to slow down. But I would also
3 hours.
I would love to have you back on to talk about, if you wouldn't mind, about your journey to motherhood, because I think that was such a beautiful part of the book. And I also don't want to discount your husband, who you talk about so beautifully in the book, and your relationship with him. And I there are some scenes you have in the book and he just seems like a really good person.
He's a good guy.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I love that. As a single woman, I like to know that there are good men out there. So I love
Olivia
that.
Olivia has a soft spot for good husbands.
I do. I have a soft spot for good husbands. Because that's my mythical creature. I'm like, okay, you have a good husband. Well, Cole, I think that you're amazing, and please come back anytime. And
thank you
for
so
anybody
much.
Out there, I know there's a lot of women who listen to this podcast. You absolutely have to read What's Eating Us. It changed my life. It really gave me freedom to ask my own questions and dive into my own history. And Cole is your friend. You really feel like you're the friend that you need while you read that book. And you are so vulnerable and open and authentic with your story. And I think that it allows for those questions to be answered in such a real way. So thank you for the work you're doing. Truly, it is life-changing.
Thank you so much for your words and for getting it and for having this wonderful conversation with the three of us. It's just been so meaningful to me. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's story. We're always here and we're so proud of you.
A Fresh Story is produced by Fresh Starts Registry, the first and only platform for everything you need to begin again. You can read the show notes and learn more about today's episode at afreshstory.com. As always, we want to remind our listeners that while we strive to provide accurate and helpful information, we are not medical doctors or mental health professionals. We want to remind you all that the information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for professional advice. We highly recommend consulting a qualified healthcare or mental health professional for any concerns or questions you may have. Remember, we are a podcast, but we are not licensed medical professionals. Always consult with your healthcare provider for any medical decisions. And as a gentle reminder, all opinions are our guests and do not necessarily reflect our own.